remarkable about the Symposium, about the Catholic intellectual tradition, is that it really is a kind of space, a 2,000 plus year long conversation that really privileges inquiry, that brings together, that integrates faith and reason, creates a space for those kinds of questions that really drive at understanding our world better so that we may glimpse God's beauty and goodness. So our final presentation of the 2024 Symposium is really a subset of a number of presentations at the Symposium from students, undergraduate students who have won this year's McGrath Award. So let me tell you a little bit about the McGrath Award, and then I'll introduce our speaker. So the McGrath Award is sponsored by my office, and it's named in honor of Father Jack McGrath, who was a dedicated teacher and celebrated, I think, and embodied Marianist education in the Catholic intellectual tradition. His career spanned nearly 60 years, and across that time, Father McGrath taught high schoolers, undergraduates, graduate students in math, in American history, in theology, and among many other roles in the Society of Mary. He served as a faculty member here at UD beginning in 1987, where he founded the Forum for the Catholic Intellectual Tradition today, which carries on in Dr. Yoakum's office, the University Professor of Faith and Culture. So the award, named in his honor, recognizes students whose research in a CAP course, a Common Academic Program course, that research demonstrates careful, deep, and creative engagement with thinkers, texts, and or themes associated with Catholic intellectual traditions. So having applied this past fall semester with work completed in a CAP course in 2023, so summer, spring, fall, this year's recipients were selected from a very strong pool of submitted research projects. I can't emphasize that enough. It was really, as the committee said and discussed these applications, we were kind of awed at the strength of the work that's going on among our undergraduates in the Common Academic Program connected to CIT. So each recipient receives a $750 scholarship along with a special medallion. And this medallion, this medal, has on the front of it an image, which I'm sure you can't see from where you are. But it's an image of a little statue that was very dear to Father McGrath. And Dr. Yoakum and I have tried to figure out the provenance of this statue. We think that it came from a 1973 General Congregation of the Marianists in Rome, when Father McGrath was there. But it's a statue of Our Lady Seat of Wisdom, which is an ancient title for Mary, with Jesus seated on her lap. And I think, in addition to being dear to Father McGrath, this image, I think, reminds us that all who stand in the Marianist tradition of education esteem the pursuit of wisdom as an encounter with God. So let me introduce our speaker, and then I'll give her her medal and turn things over to her. So Alexandra Amrhein is a sophomore from Westchester, Ohio, with a major in English and a minor in political science. She's a member of UD's Creative Writing Club and of the Letter Project, which writes letters of encouragement to those who need them. In addition, she serves on the editorial board of Line by Line, our journal of beginning student writing. She works for The Right Place. I do a lot of writing, I think. And serves as honor student welcome group leader. She enjoys writing fiction and poetry, reading historical fiction and classic literature, listening, as well as listening to music. So her award-winning research, as you can see up here, was written for ASI 110, which is first-year core course with the mentorship of Professor David Darrow. It's called The Truth Only Dies When True Stories Are Untold, the story of Reconstruction in New Orleans. So congratulations, Alexandra.
Good afternoon, some people in my class, they said that they didn't really like it because they felt like it was boring and kind of irrelevant. Ironically, though, I felt the opposite way. Because even back then, I remember thinking, history is so important because not only is it interesting, but it can also teach us if we're willing to listen to it. Human history and American history is incredible and mind-blowing to me. We've done so many amazing things, but many, many awful things as well. And I believe that we can learn from our past mistakes to continue thoughtfully and justly into a brighter future. Sometimes this process doesn't just demand learning about history. Sometimes it's also about seeing history clearly in the first place. In some cases, it's still not quite clear to people exactly what our past mistakes were. And we can't learn from our mistakes if we don't acknowledge them to begin with. And this is what, to me, the Catholic intellectual tradition is all about. It's a tradition of inquiry, a search for truth, which acknowledges the issues of the ages through the lens of Christian values and faith. When we do not acknowledge America's past errors, we're ignoring our duty to those who have been harmed, who are our fellow human beings, made in God's beautiful image, just like us. This is why I think it's so important to seek the truth about how the past has really happened. Because when we can see past injustice clearly, we're reconfirming our commitment to justice now. And there's one particular moment in our American history which often has not been seen clearly, if it's seen at all. And this is the Reconstruction era. So, for a bit of background, what was Reconstruction? It was a period in American history that lasted from the 1860s to the end of the 1880s. The end of the 1870s. After the Civil War and the emancipation of the former slaves, the South, the former Confederacy, was in ruins because their whole economy had once been structured around slavery. And the government wanted to help the Southern states recover, and get back on track with the rest of the country. But there was disagreement about how the South should look now, and this division was split across party lines. The Democrats, who are actually at the time were the more conservative of the two parties, so not the Democrats you think of today, the conservative Democrats, they wanted to keep things as close to pre-war as possible, which to them meant protecting the superiority of white plantation owners. The radical Republicans, on the other hand, was a small progressive faction of the Republican Party, and their goal was to elevate the freedmen and to grant them equal rights. And what ended up happening was that the radicals gained a surprising majority in Congress, and they immediately set to work passing a wave of progressive legislation. So this ended up being a time of enormous, rapid progress for the newly freed African Americans. But, unfortunately, that progress was thwarted by racism. There was a lot of local backlash in the South to Black people's new power. And when the Democrats, influenced by white power groups like the KKK, ultimately regained their majority in Congress and the presidency, that progressive legislation was reversed, and the hopes of Black people were once again suppressed. As W.E.B. Du Bois said, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. For some reason, this period is often overlooked. I didn't really hear about it at all until I was in the core program. And on top of that, it's often been misrepresented in research as well, providing us with an unclear picture of it. It's kind of hard to tell what exactly happened because historians are saying so many different things about it. So on that note, our project for core was to write a historiography, writing about a chosen topic on Reconstruction. And the topic that I chose to research was Reconstruction in New Orleans, Louisiana. change for all of the U.S. But hardly any city experienced its influence as much as New Orleans did. Its people were more diverse and cosmopolitan than most of the U.S., which placed it in a unique position when these new policies were enacted. It was also one of the first to have these policies put in place, so it served as sort of a testing ground for the rest of the South. Just like New Orleans Reconstruction caught my interest, it's also caught the interest of historians for many of the same reasons. However, they all have a different account of what was going on. Historians in the 1920s, for instance, had one perspective, which completely contradicts what historians were saying in the 60s about it, etc. And here's a key point. Actually, I wasn't going to be writing about Reconstruction in New Orleans. I was going to be writing a historiography, writing about these historians' research. And this is the nature of a historiography. You're not just researching the time period. You're researching the history of the topic, in the words of my professor. In other words, we weren't writing about Reconstruction. We were writing about how Reconstruction was later interpreted by historians. And this meant that my task was to first examine the research that's been done on New Orleans Reconstruction. Second, evaluate how researchers' interpretations of it evolved over time. And lastly, determine which historians were right. Basically, it's a search for truth. We're trying to figure out how Reconstruction actually happened there. So, we're going to examine the 9 historians and their research, which I chose to cover in my paper. And the titles of all these works are cited in that paper. All of these sources explore how New Orleans Reconstruction happened, but as I said, the historians have radically different perspectives about it. Some thought that it was the best thing that ever happened to the city, others thought that it was a really bad thing. In fact, as I was reading these sources, I noticed a really interesting pattern. Historians who wrote before 1960, especially in the 1920s, they saw New Orleans Reconstruction negatively, as a bad thing. Between 1960 and 1980, historians tended to write about Reconstruction as a success, a positive thing. And finally, from 1980 to today, historians view it negatively again, as a failure, but for different reasons than the historians pre-1960 did. So it turns out these overall interpretations evolved pretty linearly over time. As you can see indicated by my arrow, it kind of went from negative to positive to negative in that chronological way. And based on this pattern, I created the 3 categories you see on the screen, and I grouped the sources by their interpretation to help us better understand this change over time. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive deeper into each of these categories and see what their main arguments are, and finally, determine how valid they are. Alright, so we're going to start with my first category, which I've named the failure of Reconstruction. And this contains sources that came before 1960, mostly in the 1920s. And this category is all about Reconstruction in New Orleans being a bad thing for the city. So the historians who were writing about it, especially in the 20s, had the perspective that it was a failure. And I looked at the perspectives of these 2 historians, Dr. John Kendall and Thomas Harris. And these are the arguments they make in the sources I studied. So, first starting with Kendall. He's talking about a riot that occurred in New Orleans in 1866, a race riot. And he argues that this riot embodied a larger truth about Reconstruction there. It resulted in unnecessary violence. Then we have Harris, who's talking about the public school system. And he says that, he argues, that under the Republican administration, the education system was corrupt. He also claims that the public schools were never desegregated, despite common conceptions, but that'll be more important as we get into the later categories to return to. So overall, they both convey that Reconstruction failed due to Republicans' incompetent leadership, and also their misconceptions regarding equality. Overall, pretty pessimistic view of it. My verdict on this category is that it's not super convincing. And I have a couple reasons to back this up. First of all, the lack of substantial evidence used to support the claims being made. Both authors claim that radicals were exploiting the political system and that they were unscrupulous, but they don't really provide any quotes or logical backing to support this and make the argument seem more valid. Secondly, and potentially more importantly, there's a bias shown against African Americans and Republicanism. Kendall shows it more against people of color. He uses what I may call a blatantly racist tone in this piece, and for instance claims that white radicals were misled in wishing to aid colored people because they obviously weren't equal to white people. And on top of this, he only shows one side of the violence that was happening during the riot. He talks about black people's violence against whites, but he doesn't even consider the possibility of this going the other way around. So overall, showing a pretty strong bias there. Harris doesn't go that far, but, and I would actually say he adopts a mildly sympathetic tone towards colored people, but he places little emphasis on them, and barely even talks about them really, which is also problematic for different reasons. Also, as we've discussed, he exhibits a strong democratic bias and talks against republicanism, showing that he isn't being completely objective. So for these reasons, these sources don't seem super reliable. So I don't think that they can be considered reflective of how New Orleans Reconstruction really happened. Okay, now we're going to move into category 2, which is the recognition of the black community. And these historians who are writing primarily in the 1960s, going through the 1980s, they see New Orleans Reconstruction as being a success. They're really enthusiastic about it, in stark contrast to pre-1960. And one reason for this dramatic shift, I think, is the civil rights movement, which was the context in which these sources emerged. The empowerment of African Americans during the civil rights movement, it echoed the short-lived empowerment they experienced during Reconstruction. So it caused historians to become interested in studying it again, I think. And when they did two things. They purged the racist biases from the earlier research, and for the first time, they recognized how important black people's perspective was to understanding Reconstruction. I focused on the work of 3 historians here, Dr. Lewis Harlan, Professor Donald Reynolds, and Professor Joe Taylor, who exemplified this newly emerged perspective. And here are their arguments in a nutshell. First of all, we have Harlan. He returns to the topic of the public schools, which Harris was talking about in the 1920s. And Harlan, in stark contrast to Harris, says that desegregation in public schools definitely happened. Not only did it happen, it was a success, and he's very optimistic about it. Reynolds comes back to the topic of the 1866 riot, the same riot that Kendall was writing about. And he says at the beginning that he wants to reconsider this riot in light of previous historians' prejudices. Pretty much looking at you, Dr. Kendall. And using specific evidence, he makes it clear that, in contrast to what Kendall was saying, it was actually a racist mob of white Democrats who instigated the riot and the violence by attacking peaceful black marchers, correcting Kendall's biased account of the story, basically. And finally, we have Professor Taylor, who makes the general argument that opposition to Reconstruction in the 1860s was not due to unfair political moves by radicals, like Harris was claiming, but rather to the people of the South's personal racism. When, basically saying when black people started to gain more rights and power, it made the people of New Orleans uncomfortable. So, of course they didn't like Reconstruction, and that's why, not because of what the radical politicians were doing. Overall, all 3 are attempting to remedy the previous historian's story by flipping the interpretation. Now, African Americans are viewed as the victims, Republicans as the heroes, and the Democrats as the oppressors. I think that this category is a big improvement on the first one, but not quite there. First of all, it expels the racist perspectives. It recognizes the values of African Americans' point of view, and it includes more specific evidence. All the authors reference court testimony, diary entries, legislation, first-hand accounts, and news articles. all used to support their claims, unlike the historians in the first category we're doing. So, big improvement there. However, there's still one big issue in my eyes, and that's that these sources tend to overlook the reversal of progress that occurred at the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s. For instance, Harlan, he celebrates desegregation, but he concludes his article by discussing its successes and barely touching upon its reversal. And the other research follows a similar trend. And this removes a really important part of the story, because the reversion to formal racial hierarchies had a huge consequence on the city, and the nation for that matter. Overall, I think that this category was a step in the right direction, but its research needs to be fleshed out a bit more to be more effective. Which takes us to our final category, the failure of Reconstruction in a new light. In my view, this last category is about finally finding the objective truth. In the 1980s, when these sources begin, the research on New Orleans Reconstruction started to shift away a bit from that civil rights era enthusiasm. And in the cold light of day, they try to see Reconstruction objectively, as it truly happened. And this new perspective is demonstrated by the works of Professor William Connor, Dr. Dennis Rousey, Professor Gilles Vandal, and historian Daniel Brooke. Connor talks about a specific newspaper that was prominent during Reconstruction, called the New Orleans Tribune, and he claims that it was a way for the freedmen to express their biggest goals about political equality. However, he concludes without optimism, claiming that these goals failed ultimately because of white supremacy there. Rousey talks about the desegregation of the police force during Reconstruction. He argues that it was a great thing, but again, the initiative got shot down, and he acknowledges that. Vandal talks about Black philosophy. So there was a small community of Black philosophers in New Orleans during Reconstruction during this time, and they all had ideals of economic empowerment. And Vandal claims that these philosophers were controversial, but they were trailblazers with noble ideals. And lastly, we have Daniel Brooke, who comes back to the topic of public schools, kind of a recurring theme. And he makes a unique claim. He says that desegregation was a noble ideal, but it was rarely achieved in reality because of the local people's racism impeding it. You can see how he's kind of finding a middle ground between Harris, who said desegregation never happened, and Harlan, who said it was a success. So I think he's trying to be a bit more rational, realistic about it. So overall, these historians interpret Reconstruction policies as progress. They celebrate that. But at the same time, they don't ignore how the city ultimately reverted back to racial oppression, and so they also express disappointment. You can see kind of a mix of emotions going on here, which is often the sign of a rational and objective approach. I think that this category is really convincing. It shows an intricate level of depth. These studies dive in deep, touching upon previously unexplored details. I mean, no one, with Vandal at least, no one had ever discussed Black New Orleans Reconstruction philosophy before. It's really cool. And these are all really niche details, which give us a broader, fuller picture of what was going on at the time. These sources also maintain objectivity. They're supported by concrete evidence, like the last category, and they acknowledge both the righteous goals and failures of Reconstruction progress. Because of these reasons, I think that these studies offer the most believable picture of what was going on during Reconstruction in New Orleans. Okay, so that concludes our categories. And to wrap this up, I want to take a second to reflect and step back a bit. Think about why all of this matters. I mean, even beyond Reconstruction even. I think for me, what's most significant about all of this is being able to see, in hindsight, how badly the truth has been distorted. And this is why I believe the message of this research matters, in keeping with CIT's values. It's so important to be able to see America's history of racism, especially the undoing of Reconstruction's progress. Because if this hadn't been reversed, I don't think that a lot of the racial division and injustice we see today would be as bad as it is. To move forward, I think that first we need to look back, not just at the mistakes themselves, but at the way that these interpretations were once so biased. This in itself was a mistake. My hope is that this historiography has brought the truth into clearer focus than it's been in before, to do justice to all those impacted by racism. I believe that it's in learning from history's terrible mistakes that we can begin to right its wrongs, and to foster the righteous society in which God created us to exist. In recognizing racism in the past, we admit when human dignity has been undermined, and we reinforce the need to respect it going forward. If we can understand the truth of our past, we can help our country not repeat its errors. Then, and only then, can we look to the future. All right, really quickly, I'd like to thank my ASI 120 professor, Dr. Darrow, who helped me so much with this project. I'd also like to thank the amazing core program, the McGrath committee, and all of you for listening. I hope that you'll be able to take something away from this and apply it to your own life. So, thank you.
Are there questions or comments for Alexandra? Okay, well, thank you all once again, and thanks to our presenter and award winner. We hope that you have a wonderful evening, and thank you once again for joining us.